Subscribe for more midnight histories and let the skylight of this channel become a constant companion to the hours when glass gleams, chemicals breathe, and stories fix themselves to the emulsion of memory. The clock owned the room first, announcing the minutes in a metronome tick that carved time into narrow troughs where breath could stall and settle like dust. The studio on Pelican Lane had once been grand, a rib of skylight glass arcing high above a floor scabbed with silver nitrate, a velvet backdrop sun to the color of old wine, a posing chair whose carved lion arms were finger-worn with decades of coaxed stillness. Ether and alcohol rode the air, sweet and cold on the back of the throat, a medicinal breeze that promised clarity but delivered only a sharpened awareness of decay. The hiss of collodion came as always, subtle, serpentine, as it slid across the plate and caught the dull light, binding glass to a skin that could feel like a membrane between breath and silence. A head clamp waited behind the chair, its polished arc like a halo taken in poor faith, and the skylight shed a milky rectangle that quivered whenever sparrows batted past the panes and left their soft scrawl of sound. There were the usual sittings, tradesmen with quick-beaten hands, brides whose gloves creaked, children whose patience drained in whispers. But the post-mortem work returned in November and did not leave. The first was a boy with lashes longer than his sister's, his mouth set in a hush of sleep that could be called peaceful in the right light. The family wanted the last presents. So the parlor was drawn into the studio, and the last sleep was posed with a tender geometry, chin eased, hands laced, the suggestion of warmth coaxed by a blanket smoothed to the ribs. Eyes remained closed. Always that, for propriety. The lens, a Petzval with brass that remembered every thumbprint, gathered the skylight into a round, quick eye, and exposure ran long enough to taste the seconds like iron on the tongue, long enough for the clock to call each one by name. Fixer dripped from the tongs and ticked into the tray, blue smoke of ether lifting, a small holy incense to the alchemy of absence. A sitter came the next week, living, blinking, barely. Her pupils open lakes. When she left with her amber type wrapped in tissue, there lingered a question on the plate, a subtle shine trapped in the iris, a tremble that a glance insisted had not been there in the room. The wet collodion remembers differently than the eye. In the skylight square there was always a catchlight, a small window pinned in miniature to the wet black of the eye, but this was more than a sparkle. It had a seam, two planes of reflected glass misaligned, like a doubling inside the pupil. And when the plate was turned to breathe the light at a different angle, the double narrowed, then widened as if the window in that miniature eye were breathing quietly on its own. Explanations came as honest as tools. Collodion is blue sensitive, so the black won a little lightness and the blood warmth of the skin lost its fire. Halation made halos about the sharpest shine. Long exposure invited sighing micromotions to write parables no living gaze ever confessed. The posing stand steadied the skull, but eyes live on small tides. The skylight cut a white upon the iris and lured the mind to lean. Yet the double lived past reassurance. It returned again and again. Not in every client, but too often to be chalked on whim. There was a narrowing that suggested intent. It tempted then demanded the night. The studio after hours carried a second skeleton. The days was easy to know, light and shadow, the shaping of the familiar world. The night opened other leg bones, the caged sound of the sash, the slow fermentation of chemicals, the warm creak of drying boards, the tick-tock that moved like a blind thing along the wainscot. An unlit skylight promises only the echo of its day-bright, a lid through which moonlight draws a blade. That blade found the silver bath and turned it to a patient starfield, pinpricks of sky salt where dust had written secret alphabets. Collodion was mixed fresh, gun cotton dissolved in alcohol and ether, a syrup smelling of hospitals and rain on hot stones. The plate took its skin and the skin took the bath of silver nitrate, temperate, then cold, a shock that whispered up through the glass. Wet, dripping, ticking like a heartbeat in the tray's corner, it went into the holder and into the camera while its surface still felt the presence of fingers through tongs and breath through handkerchief. The lens was capped, then bared, then capped again. 1 second, 2, 5, 10, the slow summoning of light sufficient to convince a negative to believe. Development came in an iron breath, ferrous sulfate sliding from a black-lipped bottle. A river over the plate where the image advanced like dawn walking up a valley. Acetic acid bit its lip at the edges to keep the shadows from running wild. The face on the glass found itself, then darkened too fast, then resolved, today's alchemy favoring a gentleness no hand had quite asked for. Fixer, hyposulfite of soda for caution, or potassium cyanide for speed when nerves were steady, made its milky cloud and cleared it back to clean. The goat jar of the fix drummed into the tray, steady as the clock, and each drop sounded like a footstep in an empty hall, receding. From that night, 2 plates lived. The negative, a map of absence, and the ambrotype, a mottled positive made by darkening the back. Each caught in the pupils a kind of lantern that did not belong to the day. It was as though a second skylight were installed at the tiny scale of the eye, a private aperture that looked back into the camera. In one plate a ripple ran along the iris, a tremor like a water strider's dimple. In another the miniature window appeared rotated, as if the sitter's gaze had flickered toward the left while the face remained still as painted slate. Experiment answered obsession with rituals dressed as experiments. The skylight shuddered to a narrow cathedral slit. Then opened. Then filmed in tracing paper to milk the light, to soften the catchlight so the iris should no longer hold that knife of white. The head clamp lifted, lowered, eased forward to the occipital curve. Posing stands moved like quiet servants and vanished from the final frame because velvet covered their truth. Plates were polished, rewashed, examined for ghost silver where images from last week might rise like poor palimpsests. Tongs were replaced. Trays scrubbed in boiling water with soda crystals until glass sang its cleanliness. And still the double in the eye returned, like a moth to a wick that could not be seen until it burned. A woman came in winter, requesting a final portrait of her husband. Coal smoke had traced his lungs. The body, heavy with stillness, came by carriage and entered the studio with a courtesy that living feet never quite manage. The last sleep was arranged. It is strange how warmth can be impersonated by fabric, how a scarf knotted so, a hand's geometry adjusted, a comb passed through hair with a drop of oil, can call a room to kindness. The eyes remained closed, and the head clamp offered no insult because repose has no need of iron. The exposure ran long but not reckless. The ambrotype promised a gentle presence the family could keep on the mantel beside the case with the pressed flowers and the lock of hair. And yet, eyes closed, yes, on the negative a faint apparition formed, the pale ellipse of the sclera, the shadowed suggestion of an iris half. Beneath the lid. Inverted, the result looked like a ghost of the eye looking through its own sleep. Not painted on, not a retouch of graphite, not an error of careless contact between plate and damp backing. A veil. A hush that stared. The mind went first to optics. The Petzval throws edges like a whispering gallery, swirls the world in a subtle torque while honoring the center with a stern sharpness. Highlights bloom when varnish has gone thin, or when backing slips. Halation, that balm for understanding disobedient light, can crown a gleam with a false halo and convince bone and glass of softness they do not feel. The collodion is impatient with reds. Blue melts the image into self-regard. The skylight's white square prints in miniature on every orb, and if a window outside the skylight casts one more pale rectangle, there can be 2. And yet, even within such reason, there was a stitch that tugged at night thought. For the oval of sclera and the line that suggested an iris did not belong to any trick of backings or bloom. It resembled a thing inside the eye rising momentarily to the surface like a fish. A journal was begun. Each plate was marked not only with the sitter's name, but the hour and the dampness measured by a brass and bone hygrometer, the precise recipe of developer, the temperature of the room, the mood of the ether as judged by its ache behind the sinuses. Potassium cyanide was set aside for a week to see if hyposulfite's caution would cut fewer ghosts. Cyanide returned the next, contrition bright in its quickness. Glass was swapped for black lacquered iron, making ferrotypes that should have calmed the light into a darker, flatter obedience. Ambrotype and tintype were brought into a quarrel and left overnight to see which would argue the quietest. Then albumin prints were made from negatives, egg whites whipped, salted, glass rods dragging a gleam across paper that dried to a taut skin, silvered, exposed to the sun under glass until faces arrived grain by grain, bathed in gold chloride to tone the sepia toward noble dusk, fixed, washed, dried on boards until the corners curled with a habit like memory. In these prints, the eyes carried miniature rooms. Skylight, shadow, operator's shape. Sometimes, in the pupil, a figure appeared that was not in the studio when the shutter breathed. It became an hour's companion, that figure. A faint person standing at the edge of the miniature square inside the eye. It shifted without dignity, neither ghost nor reflection, but a third condition that asked for a name it could not have. The mind tried collodion reflection, and something answered yes, then no, then yes in a voice like wet glass rubbed by a finger. If the collodion skin is not only a receiver of light but also a provoking mirror, then perhaps some sliver of the operator's shape, some long echo of presence, may enter the event twice. Once in the honest way of rays and again in a ricochet that the emulsion, almost alive when hot with solvents, remembers with a preference it later denies. A reflection not of light from an outer surface, but a reflection that darts within the thickness, like a thought caught in its own skull. After such thinking, sleep was a pocket turned inside out. Breath found the ether again in dream. Gray vapor rose from the silver bath to make a constellated ceiling. The clock said tick and left 3 tacks blank to teach the room what silence costs. Visitors brought coin and expectation and left with portraits ringing with quiet, and some returned to press a hand on the glass and say that the eyes in their picture had shifted since morning. A young mother swore the baby's pupils were open a shade wider than before, as though a little light had moved into them late in the day, and moved out again at dusk. There is a professional smile for such a moment, practiced until the corners can lift gently while the throat tightens on its own time. The apology given for the strangeness of light is courteous and true, and also not nearly enough. When the reclusive clockmaker sent a note, as brittle as onion skin, asking for a final portrait to be made at once for his wife who had followed their infant into the serious quiet, the winter was a wax around the city, burning with a smoke that stung the eyes and made the tears feel industrious. The house was too narrow for a plate to be bathed, so the couple came to the studio in the formal way of the dead, carried, set, arranged, surrounded by their living, who had practiced their own stillness as if rehearsal could make a ritual lighter to carry. The skylight cracked thin daylight, the velvet backdrop drank shadow. The wife's eyes were closed. The infant's were closed. The clock on the wall refused to be shy, speaking each second even as the hush bled the room of everything but the need to keep faces gentle. 3 plates were made in the honest way with pity's long exposures. The 4th asked for a sin. A mirror was tilted low just out of frame to lift a second window into the eye, to tempt the collodion reflection to divide and double so that, perhaps, a breath might appear where there was none. The fingers that steadied the mirror were gloved and invisible to glass. The developer was poured as if over an altar. The image came forward. The midtones landed like a flock. Fixer inhaled. The smoke of cleaning chemistry made its thin prayer. In the infant's pupils the skylight wore 2 shapes as planned. In the mother's the second window was a little higher as the mirror had been. And in both, pupils closed as they were, the black held a shimmer like a lake finding the wind. The lids remained ligatured by their blue veins, still in death, but the pupils arrived like a rumor of seeing. No lie was told to the family. The plate was not chosen for their mantle. It slid instead beneath the blotter and waited while language remembered its manners. The family left. The studio exhaled. Then the plate was brought up and given the lamp. Once seen, such a thing cannot be put again into the sack of charms and anomalies. The collodion reflection had made a proof. It offered what the heart asked for by giving the eye a way to stare after life has set its hand on the lid. A small black mote of attention swimming in a lake the living share. It offered something worse too. A way for a gaze to return from the glass and regard the room with a slow appetite. That night the studio was stripped of kindness. Fabrics were taken down. The velvet rails were left so that their bare wooden bones could bang their small wooden knocks. The head clamp stood unabashed. The skylight opened enough to invite the moon to stand on the fingertips. Bottles were labeled with a strict hand. A notebook waited open. A plate was cleaned until breath could not find purchase on its face. Collodion poured. Silver sensitized the skin. The plate lifted dripping like a thing born into air where it had no business. The room was nobody's but its own. The operator sat before the lens. The head rest kissed the bone just above the spine in a ridiculous parody of coronation. The cap went off then on. Off then on. Exposure counted itself in the spine. 1, 2, 10, 30. The collodion wanted speed when young and now it was young. The fairest developer wanted steadiness. The hands offered it, decanting without tremor. The image arrived. A room without velvet, lens gleam, wooden floor, face. In the eyes there was a window. In the windows there were rooms. In those rooms someone stood, so small as to be grain, a penstroke human, quick as a blinking mote, then. Still. The fixer took the veil from the plate and what remained was not simple. The windows in the eyes were not mirrored copies of the skylight. Their proportions trembled as if the panes had been tallied by a hand that had seen the skylight often enough to fool itself. And the tiny figure, in that tiny window, had moved between exposures, between plates, between the honest and the daring. It moved again now, not on the plate, but there, in the eye that the plate had loaned the room. A half step. A fraction of a pivot. Not toward but along. The heart makes peculiar instructions when it no longer believes itself unattended. The mirror was tilted further. The skylight was shuttered until only a rib of bone white fell across the chair. The collodion poured twice to make a double skin. The developer got 1 more drop of acetic, then 2 less. A 5th plate, a 6th, a 7th. Each time the figure inside the eye's window found a different inch of the miniature room. In one it turned its head and a suggestion of face, dots for eyes, a chalk suggestion of nose, found the lens and steadied. The clock stammered. The double exposure that night was admitted and then refused. The first took the room empty, the second placed the operator in the chair, the third was accidentally made without the cap at all, the lens breathing for a few seconds while hands wandered bottles. Between these half-articulated errors a logic presented itself. Errors do not walk. Yet the figure walked. It kept time. It preferred moments when collodion flashed its thinner look, when the ether made a rope of sweetness around the brain and pulled the neck a little heavy. The figure was not smudged by motion. It was written in the kind of sure contour only the emulsion grants to what it loves. A person resolves the unknown with the nearest word. Knowing the nearest word is wrong does not keep it from being spoken. I came to mind as the figure lifted a hand. There was something of stance, an habitual weight in one hip, a way the shoulders forgot to be equal, that belonged to the operator without needing witness. In certain plates now the eyes did not belong to the face. They had their own patience, their own arithmetic of light, their own room. Iris, pupil, catchlight, window, figure. The layers unstacked themselves and made a corridor. It was possible to look down that corridor if the lamp was moved, if the plate was held on an angle that the fingers learned and the wrist memorized. Down that corridor a small series of skylights repeated, as if the studio contained a pocket studio, and that studio contained another, and each was a little more narrow, a little more hungry for light. In the corridor the figure was walking toward a door that could not be seen. The mind knew no door stood there. The heart found the door under the tongue. To keep faith with craft, a negative must give itself to paper. The contact frame pressed the glass to the albumin sheet. The sun found the print in a window where passers-by slowed, then pretended they had not looked in. The image ripened from cream to plum brown. Gold toning took the fruit of light and made it darker, then steadier, then something that felt almost dignified like formal dress at a funeral. The fix sighed. The wash bubbled a little, honest as a brook. The print dried and curled. The eyes still held their small architecture, and the figure stood within, turned slightly away like a person trying to hear a whisper leaking through a wall. When the clockmaker returned, not for the promised proofs, but because time had become a nuisance in his own rooms, he asked to see the plate the family had not chosen. He had felt, he said, in the quiet pocket between one tick and the next, that something owned the interim now, and that it carried the weight of someone who had been once in this very chair. It was a strange, unmercantile conversation. A photographer sells certainty of presence. It is not the business of the trade to confess the treasons of glass. Yet the plate was taken from its blotter and given to his hands. He looked at it a long while and then he nodded, not to the image, but to the corridor inside the eye as if counting its skylights. There are leaves that do not fall until after snow. They remain with the color beaten out of them, crisp as thought, clinging. The days went like that, thin to bare structure and still holding on. Commissions kept the studio obedient. Collodion frothed at the lip of the bottle when turned. Silver rinsed its bath, plates lined like soldiers. Between sittings the night work continued and grew mean. A plate was fired with mercury vapor, a trick learned and then forgotten in the same hour because the smell reached a place in the head where names are stored and jostled them into a dim mass. A piece of blackened lacquer was scored with a needle to add a hair to an eyebrow. A lens cap was removed by a hand practiced to pass for chance. Petzval swirl, corner sharpness, iris bloom, all charmed their short charms and then guttered. One evening the skylight did not reflect as it had. The glass above seemed a little closer. The white rectangle in the pupil was taller, like a door cracked rather than a window. In that white, near the lintel that was not there, the figure pressed its palm. A smudge of brightness in the smudge of small brightness. It should not have been possible. The pupil's white is habitually faithful to the shape of its source. It carries a clean boundary. Here, at the boundary, the figure had laid down a sign in the emulsion itself, something between density and breadth. The fingers were visible, 5 commas in a small paragraph. The paragraph said, "Enter. There is a mechanical path to entrapment and it loves a willing foot." The head clamp rose behind as if glad. The chair seat squeaked a threadbare amen. The plate received its skin and its bath and was walked, wet as oath, to the camera. A man can sit and look into glass until the glass is the only friend, and in that silent embrace a thing like consent can be taken from him before he knows he offered it. Exposure was written long. Collodion sighs when given too long a courtship, yet the room asked for it. The cap stayed off until the throat hurt with counting. The developer went on slowly, a pour that fell like winter honey and found its own path. The face arrived. The eyes arrived. The window in the eyes opened. Not in the plate. In the room. The skylight overhead was the same as always, smutted by city, tin-bound, veined with stress. But inside the face on the plate, the window made a draft. A cold wandered across the wrist and under the cuffs, and the lamp guttered to confess it. The corridor within the eyes widened one notch and took the room's sound into itself. The clock's tick vanished. Time went elsewhere or nowhere. Ether lifted a white palm at the edge of sight. The figure in the miniature window crossed the threshold and stepped into the corridor's nearer frame. Then it raised the hand that had printed itself and set that hand on the inner glass of the photographer's eye. There are tears the eye makes without water. There are grips that never touch muscle and yet bruise. The room did not move, but the sensation of being moved deepened. The plate in the tongs seemed heavier in the instant before the fixer, as if the image had acquired a spine. Then the fixer took its veil, and in that clearing there was a misalignment, a double printed where a single had been expected. The face on the plate, and over it, small, precise. The corridor's frame as if the plate had chosen to become a door and now confessed the hinges. A person finding a door will test it. The plate was dried by lamplight, varnished with sandarac to keep air from eating it, rocked in a breath held too long, and then propped where the lamp could find it every time the eyes lifted. The eyes lifted too often. The day's clients wished to be made beautiful and permitted to disbelieve death. The tongue discovered new kinds of silence. The night now was a hallway that ended in glass. One night turned the corner of the century, and the calendar feigned to make meaning, and the sky remained a lid. The corridor inside the eyes did not observe the date. It lengthened whenever the lamp left the plate for 3 counts, and shortened when the lamp returned, as if the attention were a breath the image depended upon. In this way attention became food. The photograph took its meals from the gaze that made it. When the clockmaker arrived without knocking, he carried under one arm the skeleton of a timepiece whose face had been removed. It exposed the slow intelligence that lives in cogs. He set it on the work table beside the plate and asked that the plate be allowed to rest a while beneath the open heart of the clock. Invitation accepted, though meaning unclear. He twisted a key in a keyhole that had not been used since repair, and the clock's mechanism began to speak. Not tick-tock, but a smaller conversation. Tooth answered tooth, spring negotiated with gear, a calendar wheel, half obscured by the cage of bridging metal, lifted a single tooth and let it down again. Within the plate, a small movement answered. The corridor shortened. The inner skylight brightened. The figure, once so minute it asked the eye to become a pin to see it, stood at a scale that allowed carrion thoughts to dream new uses. Companionship, replacement, forgiveness. The hand the figure raised matched, in its commas, the hand that had raised the developer for 20 years. The face it turned had the fault in the left cheek that shaving never quite forgave. It was a faithful stranger. It lifted a second hand and placed it against the inner of the inner glass. A last plate was made. No commission stood on the morrow. The calendar was a blank warren of gray squares waiting to be trapped in. The plate was glass of a thickness chosen for weight, the way a stone is chosen for its throw, though nothing would be thrown. The collodion was fresh. The silver bath had been decanted, filtered through cotton, sweetened like a servant who wants to stay. The developer was compounded with more care than has been given to any prayer in any room on Pelican Lane. The fix, humble hypo, no cyanide, no speed, only the long, safe dissolution of what should not remain. The exposure was taken not of a face in a chair, but of the plate itself standing on the work table before the camera, a mirror that did not shine, a black that ate the room and gave back something that did not belong to the usual array of light. The lens opened. The corridor appeared, already there, ready, a mouth inside a mouth. The developer went on and made a clearing in which the corridor widened, as if grateful for the service. The fixer lifted the veil and left the door. A person will hesitate when a threshold looks too much like a mouth. The hesitation is not cowardice. It is an antiquity in the bones, a memory of caves that had the wrong smell and of water that led down where feet could not agree. The hand that reached now to lift the plate had its hesitation measured into it by the clock that did not tick. It trembled. The plate did not tremble. The door on the plate was steady. In the corridor the figure waited without impatience, knowing the person holding the plate had been walking toward this pause since the first head clamp tightened on the first day. The skylight taught the eye to expect honesty from glass. One foot crossed and there was a feeling like stepping through cottage cheese, like chestnut honey, like fog. Then the arm found its elbow beside itself, and the shoulder decided to be elsewhere. The breath went up the corridor and did not return to the ribs. The plate grew suddenly light in the hands that held it, a weight like paper, and at the same time a sound came from the head clamp as if it had remembered a skull in it. The person in the room stood before the chair. The person in the plate stood inside the corridor. There was a moment when both persons felt a draft and then a thickening, as if air had become a slow syrup. The lamp made a funnel of light over the varnish. The varnish showed a small pattern where it had dried too quickly, crazing they call it, hairlines like a net drawn to catch nothing. In those lines a face watched from far away. It had eyes that carried a corridor. In those eyes a figure stood, tiny, listening. The clock decided to discover how long a second can be when it refuses to pass. Days came like windows opened then closed by a hand in another room. Commissions knocked then did not knock again. The studio smelled of ether, of alcohol, of the patient amenity of collodion. It also smelled of someone unable to remember when last bread had been purchased. The head clamp kept its counsel. The skylight made a sheet of white on the floor that moved with the earth and found things to reveal. Prints, grains of silver, the seam of a floorboard that had always been there and only now took attention. The plate on the table showed, in the eyes of the face in the varnish, a corridor that held a person who was revising the definition of standing still. At last the clock's tongue found a word. It said tack. Then after a long while it said tick. Then with a weak joy it said both in order. Time returned like a man who has mistaken a street and blushed. The studio resumed the artifice of ordinary. The plate, however, would not resume anyone's former peace. The eyes in the plate held their small door. In the door a figure waited who would never step out expressly and would never step back. The figure waited as hunger waits, set, civilized, silent, requiring. Visitors still come. The brave of them bring the plate near the lamp and hold it with a thumb mark no cloth can erase. They say that the eyes in that image seem to follow. An old claim too common to be believed. They set the plate down and the room inhales again. The clock continues. The skylight writes its small bright on the floor and then at dusk denies it. The collodion breath hisses only when asked. The fixer drips only when attended. The tick-tock is a simple animal and does not mind its cage. And now the corridor inside the eyes of every new portrait measures attention like a banker. Catchlights multiply in pupils where only one window lies. The head clamp has become gentler, or the skulls have learned gentleness. The hyposulfite washes the uncommitted silver away, and there remains in the black a stamped possibility that the gaze can be tempted into forever. A reflection has offered proof of life where there is none. Then, hungry for its own proof, it asked to be fed. Plates have been made for a decade and more on Pelican Lane, with negatives tucked in tissue and positives kissed shut in velvet cases, and in each there is now a corridor of some length, and in some there is a figure, and in some the figure stands closer than the eye will admit without the breath losing track of itself. It remains an open question whether the first exchange was entrance or exit. The person standing in the room now moves with the memory of a lens cap lifted too slowly. The person in the plate stands very still as plates demand. Each has learned the other's patience. The clock has learned to pity them both. Subscribe to keep the skylight lit and the corridor open, to let this channel's night work continue until the last plate dries and the last eye learns how long it can refuse to blink.